Use your pause button if necessary. Okay, let's begin.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, you arrived
Yes,
in
I
Guatemala.
arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
You arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala?
Isaac,
On the
you
Day of the
arrived
Dead.
in Guatemala.
Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, you didn't arrive on
No,
November
I
3rd.
didn't arrive
You
in Guatemala
arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
You arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
You arrived in Guatemala on November
I arrived
1st.
in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, you wasn't angry about
No,
this
I
holiday.
wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, you wasn't sad about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
Isaac, you were curious about
I
this
was,
holiday.
AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
You were curious about this holiday.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious
You were
about?
curious about the day of the dead.
Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
You were curious about the day of the dead.
No, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
You went to cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
To the cemetery. Of course.
Yeah,
You went
I
to the
went
cemetery.
to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Isaac, you went to the cemetery.
Me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
You went to the cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
You went to the cemetery on the day of the dead, November 1st.
The Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go? to the cemetery.
She went to the cemetery to see what was
To
happening.
see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
AJ, of course, she went to the
AJ
cemetery to see
went to the
what
cemetery
was happening.
To see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
She went to the cemetery in
In
Guatemala.
The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is a holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is November 1st.
The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No,
No,
it
it
was
wasn't
boring.
Was it interesting?
Yes, it was
Yes,
interesting.
yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel
You felt it
about
was
the cemetery?
interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The cemetery,
The cemetery.
it was
The cemetery
interesting.
was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
The cemetery was interesting on
It was
November
interesting
1st, the Day of the Dead.
On the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
Yes,
Was the atmosphere very sad?
no, the atmosphere
No,
was
the
very
atmosphere
sad.
was not
Was not
sad.
sad.
The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Happy. The atmosphere was
The
happy.
atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was like a
The
party.
atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery.
The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, the atmosphere was
No,
not at my
not
house.
at my house. The
The
atmosphere was
atmosphere
like a
not
party
like a party
in the
in the
cemetery.
cemetery.
The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
Families were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves. Right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families who were sitting around the graves.
The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, they weren't sitting around
No,
the trees.
they weren't sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting?
They were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes, families were sitting
they
around
were
the
sitting
graves of their
around the
dead
graves
ancestors.
of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, they weren't sitting around the graves
No,
of
not really.
friends.
They were sitting around the graves
They were
of their
sitting
dead
around the graves of
ancestors.
their dead ancestors.
Who was sitting around the graves?
Families were sitting
Families
around
were
the
sitting
graves
around
of
the
their dead
graves.
ancestors.
Whose graves were they sitting around?
They were sitting around the graves of their dead
Were they
ancestors.
sitting around? Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves.
Mhm.
They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Mhm.
Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves?
They were sitting around the graves of their dead
friends.
ancestors.
Ancestors, right? They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers.
Mm.
Okay. Who cleaned the graves?
Families
That's right, the
cleaned.
families.
Family was cleaned the
What
graves.
did they add?
They added fresh
They
flowers.
Fresh flowers. Did they add food?
No, they didn't add food.
They didn't add food. Did they add money?
No, they didn't add money.
No, they didn't add
They added
money.
fresh flowers.
They added fresh flowers. What did they clean?
They cleaned to the graves.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean?
They cleaned to the graves of their dead
Their
ancestors.
right? They cleaned their ancestors' graves. Where did they add flowers?
They added fresh flowers to the
They
graves.
added flowers to the graves. That's right. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
You walked through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, you didn't walk
No, I
through the
didn't
park.
walk through the park. I walked through the cemetery. Where did I walk?
You walked through the
Through the
cemetery.
cemetery. Who walked through the cemetery?
I say, of course, you walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery or did I walk through the park?
You walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. That's right. And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, she admired the beauty
No,
of the
I
trees.
didn't admire the beauty of the trees. Did I admire the beauty of the children?
No, you didn't admire the
I
beauty
didn't
of the
admire
children.
the beauty of the children.
You admired the beauty of
What
all
did I
the
admire?
colorful flowers. You admired the
Flowers,
beauty
right? Yeah, I admired
of
the
all the
beauty
colorful flowers.
of all the colorful flowers. Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
AJ, you admired the beauty
That's
of
right,
all the
AJ,
colorful flowers.
Admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
The flower was on the
On
grass.
the graves, or in the cemetery. The flowers were on the graves
Mhm.
in the cemetery. Were the flowers in the park?
No, they was
No,
in the park.
they weren't in the park. Were the flowers in my house?
No, they wasn't in
No,
my
they
house.
weren't in my house. Where were the flowers?
The flower was on the
The
grass.
flowers were on the graves in the cemetery. Where did I walk?
She walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. When did I walk through the cemetery?
She walked through the cemetery on November 1st, the day of
November
the dead.
1st, the Day of the Dead. Right, November 1st, the Day of the Dead, I walked through the cemetery. What was the cemetery like?
The cemetery was like a party.
Like a party. It was like a party. The cemetery was like a party. Was I curious about this holiday?
Yes, you were curious about this
Yes,
holiday.
I was curious about this holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
You were curious about the day of the dead.
Yeah, the Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I walked through the cemetery. There was also color in the sky because many kids were flying kites. Where was the color?
In the sky. In the sky.
In the sky, that's right, in the sky. Why was there color in the sky?
Because kids were flying kites.
Because kids were flying kites. The kites. There was color in the sky because kids were flying kites. Who were flying kites?
Kids were flying kites.
Kids were flying kites. Was the sky colorful or was the sky
The sky was colorful.
The sky was colorful. What was colorful?
The sky.
The sky. Right? The sky was colorful. Why was the sky colorful?
Because kids were flying kites.
Because kids were flying kites. What were the kids flying?
Kites. Kids were flying kites.
That's right. The kids were flying kites. Where were they flying kites?
They were flying kites in the cemetery.
In the cemetery. The kids were flying kites in the cemetery. Who was flying kites in the cemetery?
Kids were flying kites in the
Kids.
cemetery.
Children. Kids were flying kites in the cemetery. Some families were having a picnic next to the graves. We, in the United States, don't do this. So some families were having a picnic next to the graves. They ate, they drank, and they chatted together. Did they eat?
Yes, they ate.
Yes, they ate. Who ate?
Families ate.
Families, right? Of course, families ate. What did they eat?
They ate watermelon food.
Well, they ate Guatemalan food. Right? Food from Guatemala. Right? The families ate Guatemalan food. Did they eat American food?
No, they didn't
No,
eat American
they didn't
food.
eat American food.
They ate watermelon food.
food. Where did they eat Guatemalan
They ate watermelon food in the cemetery.
in the cemetery, right? They ate food in the cemetery. They ate Guatemalan food in the cemetery. They also drank in the cemetery. Did they drink water in the cemetery?
No, they didn't drink water in the cemetery.
What did they drink
They
in
drank
the
beer.
cemetery?
Beer.
They drank beer. Who drank beer?
Families drank beer.
The families drank beer. What did they eat?
They ate watermelon food.
Guatemalan food. They ate Guatemalan food and drank beer. Did they drink beer or did they drink water?
Of course, they drank
They
beer.
drank beer. Where did they drink beer?
They drank beer in the cemetery.
They drank beer in the cemetery. When did they drink beer?
They drank beer on November 1st, the day of the dead.
November 1st, the day of the dead. They drank beer. When did they eat?
They ate on November 1st, the day of the dead.
On November 1st, the day of the dead. Did they chat together?
Yes, they chatted
Yes,
together.
they chatted together. Who chatted together?
Families chatted
The
together.
families, of course, the families chatted together. When did they chat together?
They chatted together on November 1st, the day of the dead.
the dead. People laughed and smiled. In the United States, cemeteries are always somber. Are cemeteries happy in the United States?
No,
No,
cemeteries aren't happy in the United
Cemeteries
States.
aren't
Cemeteries are always somber.
happy in the United States. Cemeteries are always somber, sad, and serious. Are cemeteries serious in the United States? Yes,
Yes.
they are. In the United States,
In the United States,
cemeteries
cemeteries are always somber.
somber. They are always serious. In the United States, are cemeteries somber or are cemeteries
In
happy?
the United States, cemeteries are always somber.
Somber. Right? Cemeteries are always somber in the United States. Was the cemetery somber in Guatemala?
No, cemeteries
No, it wasn't somber.
cemeteries are always somber in the
The
United
cemetery
States.
wasn't somber in Guatemala. But in the United States, cemeteries are always somber. Are cemeteries always somber in Guatemala or in the United States?
Cemeteries are always somber in the United
States.
States.
cemeteries are always
In the
somber.
United States.
Where are cemeteries always somber?
In the United States, cemeteries are always
United
somber.
States, that's right. In the United States, cemeteries are always somber. Are they happy?
No, not happy.
No. They're always
Cemeteries are always
somber.
somber.
Cemeteries in the United States are always somber. Very, very somber. We certainly never have festivals or parties next to graves. Do we have parties next to graves?
No, we don't have
No,
a party
don't.
next to
We
graves.
don't have parties next to graves. Do we ever have parties next to graves?
No, we never have party next to
No,
graves.
we never have parties next to graves. Do we ever have parties in restaurants?
Yes, we have party in
Yes, we
restaurant.
have parties in restaurants. But we never have parties next to graves. Do we ever have parties in houses?
Yes, we have
Yes, we
party
do. We have
in
parties
houses.
in houses. But we never have parties next to graves. Do we ever have parties next to graves?
No, we don't have
No.
party next to
Never.
graves.
We never have parties next to graves. Where do we never have parties?
Next to graves.
Next to graves.
We never have
Never have
party
parties
next to graves.
Do we ever?
No, never.
No.
We never have party
We never
next
have
to
parties
graves.
next to graves. Not ever. Never. We don't laugh, or play music, or fly kites in
Yes.
cemeteries either. Do we laugh in cemeteries usually?
No, we don't laugh.
No, we don't. We don't laugh in cemeteries. Where don't we laugh?
We don't laugh in the cemetery.
Cemeteries. That's right. Okay. I found that I preferred the Guatemalan approach. Did I find that I preferred the American approach? Or did I find that I
You
preferred
found that you
the
prefer the
Guatemalan
watermelon approach.
The Guatemalan approach? I found that I preferred the Guatemalan approach. Did I find that I preferred the American approach? No, I didn't. I didn't find that I preferred the American approach. I found that I
Watermelon
preferred the
approach.
Guatemalan approach. Which approach did I prefer?
Watermelon
The
approach.
Guatemalan
I
approach.
prefer the watermelon approach.
Did I prefer the American approach?
No,
No.
you didn't
Who
prefer the watermelon,
preferred
the
the Guatemalan
American
approach?
approach. Isaac,
Me, AJ.
you prefer the
I
watermelon
preferred
approach.
the Guatemalan approach. I found that I preferred the Guatemalan approach. I liked the way they remembered and celebrated those who had passed away. Did they celebrate those who were alive?
No, they didn't.
No,
They didn't
they didn't
celebrate those who was alive.
They
They
celebrated
celebrated
those who
had
had
passed away.
Did they celebrate those who had passed away? Or those who had
They celebrated those who had passed away.
They celebrated those who had passed away. Who celebrated those who had passed away?
Watermelons celebrated those who had passed away.
Celebrated those who had passed away. When did they celebrate
They
those
celebrated
who had
on
passed
no.
away?
They celebrated those who have passed away on November 1st, the Day of the Dead.
November 1st. On the Day of the Dead, November 1st, they celebrated those who had passed away. Who celebrated?
Watermelons.
The
Watermelons celebrated those who have passed away.
Celebrated. Who did they celebrate? They celebrated those who
Those
had
who have
passed
passed
away.
away.
I liked that they acknowledged death instead of denying it the way Americans do.
Mm.
Who liked that they acknowledged death? Yeah, me, AJ. Right?
AJ,
I liked that they
you like
acknowledged
acknowledge death?
Did they acknowledge money?
No,
Or did they acknowledge death?
you like acknowledge
They
death.
acknowledged death.
They acknowledge
What
death.
did they acknowledge?
They acknowledged death.
Death. They acknowledged death. Who acknowledged death?
Watermelon
Guatemalans, right? Guatemalans acknowledged
acknowledge death.
death.
Watermelon acknowledge
Did
death.
they acknowledge death? Or did they acknowledge
They
money?
acknowledge death.
They acknowledged death instead of denying it. Who denies death?
Americans deny death.
Americans deny death. Do Guatemalans deny death? No, not
No.
Guatemalans. Guatemalans don't
Americans
deny
deny
death.
death.
Americans deny death. Do I like that Americans deny death? No, I don't. I don't like it. I don't like
I don't
that
like
Americans
that Americans
deny
deny
death.
death.
But I like that there is life as well as death in Guatemalan cemeteries. I liked that. Did I like their cemeteries?
Yes, you like
Yes, I liked their cemeteries.
cemeteries.
What did I like?
You like
Their
watermelon
cemeteries.
cemeteries.
Guatemalan cemeteries. I liked Guatemalan cemeteries. Did I like Guatemalan cemeteries? Or did I like Guatemalan
You like
restaurants?
watermelon cemetery.
I liked Guatemalan cemeteries. Whose cemeteries did I like?
Watermelon cemeteries.
Guatemalans, right?
You
Guatemalan
like
cemeteries.
watermelon
I liked the
cemeteries.
Guatemalans cemeteries. Guatemalans cemeteries. Whose cemeteries did I like? The
Guatemalan
Guatemalan
cemetery.
cemeteries. I liked the Guatemalans cemeteries. Guatemalans call it the Day of the Dead, but it is also a day to appreciate life. Okay, that is
Bye
all.
bye.